I've covered a lot of ground in the last videos, so now's a good time to do a cleanup pass. Today's session is going to be mostly a totally chaotic assortment of cleanup and small changes. Since there's not too much of interest happening throughout this video in my opinion, I'm going to kind of go through it quickly, so this should be a short one. Let's get into it. Thing number one, I have this script that I wrote at one point for building every target in my code base. And it's helpful to have this for making sure everything is still working from time to time. But it's also something that's easy for me to forget when I'm making new stuff. So during a cleanup like this, it's a good time to go and make sure all my targets are actually in there. Thing number two, I have a lot of new Scratch programs sitting around. I'd like to make sure I've converted them all back to nice isolated examples for myself in the future if that's how I want them to be. And I'm going to start by turning the file lib.freetype scratch.cpp into a FreeType example.cpp and taking out all the parts that were about the font baker that have now been moved into the code base anyways. Thing number three, OpenGL Scratch was a space for iterating on the specific rendering features I wanted. This has all been transplanted into the codebase now too, and so it doesn't really serve a useful purpose to have it sitting around in a separate OpenGL iteration space. My wiggle example that I already made for when I was setting up the Win32 OpenGL stuff in the first arc works well as a good starting point for new OpenGL experiments, so I can scrap this Scratch base. Thing number four, my STB TTF Scratch sort of hit a dead end when I was working on it. It's not really a complete example yet, but I also don't have those concepts anywhere else in my code base, so I don't want to lose them. So I'm just going to leave this as an unfinished sort of set of Scratch notes for now. Thing number five, I want to find an easy way to let rectangles and text be rendered in a single batch. Each font I use has to have its own texture, and I can only use one texture for each batch, so I'll never be able to mix text from two different fonts with the system I have right now. But the texture shouldn't matter for rectangles since they don't use a texture, so if I do it right, I should be able to mix rectangles and text from one font in a single batch. I decided to try doing this with an extra check in the Vertex shader that looks at the UV coordinates to see if the maximum UV coordinate is 0, in which case it knows that we're not actually using UVs, and then set a texture override that gets sent to the fragment shader. And here's a batch with rectangles and text working on the right-hand side of the screen. Thing number six, I decided to try out a different organization for the high-level batch helper layer and the string drawing helping layer. I set up a new folder called draw and move all the APIs from the tool2d helpers over into the draw folder. Along the way, I'm shortening the name since this is an application-facing API, and I often want to have shorter names for things that are being used directly in application code since I write a lot of application code on top of an API like this. While I'm here, I'm also going to rethink the helper API, and instead of having it use a single quad with all of the parameters spelled out, I'm just going to have it pass a pointer to a quad. I'm not sure why I didn't do this in the first place. This seems like the better way to do it. I also want to make sure that this contains the string drawing helpers, so I'm going to move them from the font layer where I was first putting them when I wasn't sure how I was going to organize this, and take them into the draw layer. Now I have this new draw layer that's going to depend on font and tool2d at the same time, rather than having one of the font or tool2d layers depend on the other layer. Finally, thing number 7, I want to try an OpenGL feature that I've never used before, but that I discovered recently, which is that when you have vertex shaders, they send information to fragment shaders, but they only send out information on a per vertex basis. So when you get fragments, they have to interpolate the values between vertices to fill in the sort of in-between values of all the fragments that the vertex shader didn't actually output. And sometimes what you actually want is an entire system of the same number coming from that vertex shader. So in our case, for instance, I have these quads. Each quad has certain aspects to it, like the roundness of its corners and the thickness of its outline, which is the same across the entire quad. And so I don't need any interpolation to happen. And it turns out there's a way I can mark it for not interpolating by telling the shader to output a flat vertex. Now, I don't know if this helps or hurts anything. I could imagine that not doing interpolation work might speed up the pipeline, but it might also be irrelevant or even not do anything. But I just want to test my understanding for now and see if this does what I am assuming it does. Well, I think it was working here. I guess I didn't really come up with a way to verify it in the moment, which is unfortunate. I probably should have done that. In hindsight, I can think of some things I could do to test how that flat keyword works, but since I didn't do it, this is where that ends. It looks like I at least got a chance to review the shader code and organize it a little bit, so that's nice. Anyway, that's enough cleanup for today. There are still some important things to look at, error handling and helping the user manage multiple fonts and getting icons in there still. So we've got a little bit more to do in this arc, and I'll see you then.